The courtroom was a theater of anticipation, a stage set for the daily drama of justice. The familiar sounds were a prelude to the performance, the rustle of papers, the hushed whispers of spectators, and the sharp, distant sound of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at her bench, a figure of practiced calm and professional detachment. Her black robes, a uniform of her authority, seemed to absorb the ambient light of the room. This was her domain, a place where she meticulously applied the law, where every case was a puzzle to be solved with logic and precedent. It was another day, another docket, or so she thought. The bailiff's voice, a steady, rhythmic cadence, cut through the low hum. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting on the cool, polished oak of the bench. She glanced up at folders neatly stacked before her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. The charges were boilerplate, a grim litany she had seen countless times before. A familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest, a feeling she had long since accepted as part of the job. It was the predictable sadness of another life derailed, another soul ensnared in the grinding gears of the system. She prepared herself to face another statistic, a fleeting, forgettable face in a long procession of them. But when the defendant was brought in, her world tilted on its axis. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not a stranger. He was James Anderson, her James. The name echoed in her mind, not as a defendant's, but as a memory, a ghost from a past she had buried deep. Her throat tightened, a physical sensation that threatened to choke her professional composure. A flood of memories, so vivid they felt like a physical force, surged forward. The summer afternoons they spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana, their laughter echoing in the humid air. The late-night talks under the vast, sheltering branches of the magnolia tree in her backyard. It sent a sweet and heavy perfume on the breeze. The solemn promises they made as kids, a pact to always have each other's backs, no matter what. The boy she remembered was a whirlwind of energy and optimism, a dreamer whose eyes held the reflection of a future far from their segregated town. But the man standing before her was a different story. His shoulders were hunched, a posture of defeat and burden. His face was a roadmap of hardship, lined with years of struggle and the weight of a life she couldn't possibly imagine. Yet, despite the changes, his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. They were the same eyes that had once held hers under the stars, filled with a quiet hope and a fierce determination. Eleanor's grip on the gavel faltered for the first time in her career. For a fleeting moment, she was not Judge Eleanor Hayes, a pillar of the legal system. She was simply Eleanor, a girl from Hammond, standing before a ghost from her past. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as she tried to reconcile the impossible. The man in chains was her childhood friend, and she was the one tasked with passing judgment on him. James looked up, his expression a complex mixture of shock, resignation, and a flicker of recognition that mirrored her own. But he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly, as if the weight of their shared past was too much to bear. The courtroom waited. Eleanor forced herself to speak, her voice a fragile bridge between her two realities. "Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" James's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable, but his words were clear. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of panic and a desperate need for answers. She wanted to stop everything, to demand to know what had happened to him, how their paths had diverged so drastically. But her role as a judge, a role she had spent a lifetime building, demanded composure, demanded impartiality. She said, "Proceed," her voice steadier than she felt. As the prosecutor began his opening statements, Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just any case. This was James. And somehow she had to figure out how to separate her past from her present, her heart from her head, before it was too late. The courtroom blurred as Eleanor's mind drifted to a time long before her black robes and the gavel in her hand. A time when she was just a girl named Eleanor, and he was just a boy named James, growing up on opposite sides of Hammond, Louisiana. The town itself was a silent character in their story, a place divided not by distance, but by the unspoken, unwritten rules of its segregated society. Her family's house was a modest one-story with white picket fence, a symbol of a certain kind of stability and respectability. James's family lived in a weathered home at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by fields that stretched out to the horizon. Their friendship had been an anomaly, an act of quiet rebellion against a world that told them they shouldn't be together. They remember their meeting with the clarity of a deeply etched memory, an accidental encounter at the edge of a creek where she had wandered too far from her own backyard, drawn by the sound of the water. James had been there, fishing, his line tangled hopelessly in the reeds. She, a curious girl with a boundless sense of adventure, had offered to help. That simple gesture, that shared moment of struggle and cooperation had turned into years of secret adventures and shared dreams. They built forts in the woods, traded stories, and confided in each other their deepest fears and wildest ambitions. He had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur, "Eleanor, you ever think about leaving this place? Like, really getting out? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed then, a light, carefree sound brushing off the idea as if it were a silly notion. But James wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always make room for people like him. He saw the sideways glances, heard the whispered comments, and felt the weight of a system that was designed to keep them apart. Their bond deepened despite the whispers, the sideways glances, and the outright approval from both sides of town. But the pressure was always there, a low, grayed hum, like a weight neither of them could shake. And then, one day, it all ended. It was the summer before high school, a hot, sticky afternoon when Eleanor's father caught them sitting on the porch together, their conversation a comfortable, easy rhythm. His voice had been cold, sharp with an authority she had never heard him use before. "Eleanor, get inside. Now." She'd hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place, a look of resignation already in his eyes. "Go on," he had said, quietly, his voice tinged with a deep, profound sadness. But they hadn't seen each other again. Not really. Her father forbade her from going near James, and soon after, his family moved away. Eleanor, heartbroken but resilient, threw herself into school. Her ambitions, her dreams of justice and fairness became a new kind of escape. She went to law school, a world away from the dusty roads of Hammond, chasing dreams of a perfect, impartial justice system. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like, the boy who had shown her a world beyond her picket fence. Now, sitting on the bench, she wondered what had become of James after she'd walked into that house and closed the door on their friendship. Her record showed a series of arrests for minor offenses, petty theft, loitering, nothing that screamed a violent nature. But then again, how much of someone's life could you truly see in a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice snapped her back to the present. He was describing the alleged crime with a cold, clinical precision. James was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, a laceration to the forehead and some bruising. The cash register had been emptied, and James was picked up a few blocks away, the cash allegedly still in his possession. Eleanor studied James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his expression was unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The courtroom adjourned for a lunch break, giving Eleanor a moment to gather her thoughts, to put the pieces of her past and present in their proper places. But they didn't fit anymore. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant, Margaret, approached her with a hesitant expression. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted." Eleanor hesitated. Should she confide in Margaret? Would it be unprofessional to admit that she knew the defendant, that this wasn't just another case for her? Instead, she shook her head. "No, I'm fine, Margaret. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be, when the past she had buried so deeply was sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed, a tangible energy filling the air. Reporters scribbled notes, the clerk shuffled papers with a soft, rhythmic sound, and the prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Richard Powell, stood poised and ready to deliver his case. Powell was a master of the stage, his every movement calculated to project confidence and certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice firm and commanding, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the cash register contents. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The prosecutor's tone was clinical, detached, as if James were nothing more than a name on a docket, a faceless perpetrator in a crime report. She glanced at James, whose gaze remained fixed on the table before him, his posture a study in quiet resignation. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, then rose to present her opening statement. She was young, her suit crisp, and her posture confident, with a voice that carried across the room with surprising authority. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward, but it's not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the start. We will show that there is more to this story and that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness was called to the stand, the store clerk who had been working on the night of the incident. He described seeing a man fitting James' description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed, as if he were recounting a story he had told many times before. Lisa's cross-examination was surgical, precise, and aimed directly at the heart of the prosecution's case. "Mr. Chambers," she began, her tone even, "you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" "Yes," the witness replied, his voice wavering slightly. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really. It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa nodded, pacing slightly, her movements deliberate. "So you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" "Well, no, but—" "No further questions," Lisa said, cutting him off before he could elaborate. Eleanor noticed James shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring as if the exchange had given him a small glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was a surveillance video from the store. The footage was grainy and poorly lit, showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution argued that the person in the video was James, but the quality made it difficult to discern any identifying features. As the video played, Eleanor studied it intently. Could this truly be James? The figure moved quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off-screen. The footage ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. James's defense was based on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was unwilling to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate James's innocence, but the jury's expressions hinted at skepticism. As the trial wore on, Eleanor felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness, but how could she be when every moment reminded her of their childhood? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now a man fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edges of the gavel. She wanted to talk to James, to ask him directly what had happened, but she knew she couldn't. Any contact outside the courtroom would jeopardize the case and her career. As she watched James being escorted out of the room in shackles, Eleanor's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to reveal the truth, but for the first time, She wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial reached a pivotal moment. It was the defense's turn to present their case, and Lisa Porter called her first key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to show. Officer Harris, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, took the stand. Lisa approached him with deliberate calm. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice steady and respectful. "You were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That's right," he replied, his tone clipped. "You stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And what led you to believe he was the suspect?" He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "He matched the description. A black male, mid-40s, wearing dark clothing." Lisa's eyebrows raised slightly. "Dark clothing," she repeated slowly. "But the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession when you searched him?" He hesitated. "No, but he could have discarded it." Lisa took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "Could have. Did you or any other officer conduct a search of the surrounding area to locate this supposed hoodie?" Harice's jaw tightened. "We didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly." Lisa pressed on, her tone gaining a sharper edge. "So, to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description without physical evidence linking him to the scene." The officer's silence spoke louder than any words. Eleanor's gaze flickered to the jury. A few members exchanged uncertain glances. Lisa wasn't done. "Mr. Harris, do you recall if Mr. Anderson said anything at the time of his arrest?" He protested, said he was innocent. "And did you consider investigating his claim, or did you assume guilt solely based on his appearance?" Harice's face reddened. "I followed protocol." "Protocol," Lisa repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed again as Harris stepped down, his credibility visibly shaken. Eleanor's heart pounded. This wasn't just a trial now, it was a reckoning, not just for James, but for a system that seemed too eager to condemn him. The defense's next move was unexpected. Lisa introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that based on the height and build of the individual in the video, there was no definitive way to confirm it was James. Furthermore, a deeper analysis showed that the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising serious questions about its reliability and the chain of custody. The prosecution attempted to dismiss the testimony as conjecture, but the jury appeared unsettled. A shadow of doubt crept into the room, and Eleanor could feel its weight. As the day drew to a close, James was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. Lisa had warned him of the risks, but James insisted. He stood, his chains clinking softly as he approached the stand. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity that cut through the sterile atmosphere of the courtroom. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began, addressing the jury directly. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people. But I didn't do this. That night, I was walking home from a friend's house when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask questions. They just decided I fit the bill." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this, I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's throat tightened as James sat back down. His words hung in the air, a plea not just for justice, but for humanity. She glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of emotions, doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimonies. It was a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumption. Eleanor knew that her role wasn't just to uphold the law, it was to interpret it in a way that served true justice.
The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation.
The closing arguments were delivered with a finality that hung in the air. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, delivered his with practiced precision, leaning heavily on the circumstantial evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he stated, his voice ringing with conviction, "the evidence, while not a Hollywood movie, points to one undeniable conclusion. A man was assaulted, a store was robbed, and James Anderson was found a few blocks away with cash on him. I urge you to trust the system, to trust the process, and to deliver a verdict that reflects the facts." Lisa Porter, however, pleaded for the jury to see beyond the surface, to consider the glaring holes in the case and the humanity of the man on trial. She spoke of the altered surveillance footage, the vague description that could fit countless individuals, and the officers who had assumed guilt based on a superficial match. "You have the power to see what the system failed to see," she urged. "You have the power to protect a man who has been judged his whole life. Do not let prejudice be the final verdict. Do not let him be just another statistic." Eleanor listened intently, her face impassive, but her mind raced. Her role was clear. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final word if their verdict left room for interpretation. The burden of ensuring justice, of ensuring that the truth truly mattered, weighed heavily on her. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs or whispered among themselves. James sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He hadn't looked at Eleanor since the first day of the trial, and she couldn't blame him. What could she possibly say to make any of this better? The shared looks, the unspoken memories, were a chasm between them. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, a piece of paper trembling in her hands. Eleanor held her breath. "In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant." The pause was unbearable, an eternity of possibility and dread. "Not guilty." The room erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers. Eleanor tapped her gavel, the sharp sound restoring order. James's shoulders sagged as if a monumental weight had been lifted, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but it was clear this victory came at a cost. The past week had taken a toll, leaving scars that went deeper than a prison sentence ever could. Eleanor addressed the court, her voice steady and clear. "The jury has spoken, Mr. Anderson. You are free to go. Court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor lingered behind, watching James as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word. But then he turned and approached her. The room was nearly empty now, just a few clerks tidying up and Margaret gathering files. James stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded, but his eyes holding a direct gaze she hadn't seen in decades. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, his voice still rough. "But I'd like to know, why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten, the words catching. "Because I couldn't. I had to be fair. If I'd said anything, it might have jeopardized the case." James studied her, his face a mix of hurt and understanding. "Fair," he repeated, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "That's the thing, Eleanor. The world's never been fair, not for people like me." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right. I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." James sighed, the tension in his posture easing slightly. "We were kids. We didn't know any better. But you know now, don't you?" "I do," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "And I'm sorry." James gave a faint nod, then turned and walked away, his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Eleanor sat alone in the empty courtroom, the weight of his words pressing on her. She had upheld the law, but the trial had revealed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any one person. For Eleanor, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that her position wasn't just a seat of power, but a platform for change. As she left the courthouse that evening, the fading sun casting long shadows across the steps, Eleanor made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure the future held more than hollow promises of fairness. It would be hard, perhaps even impossible, but she owed it to James and to herself to try.